Hidden among the trees near the convent stood a nun and a coachman. The two were locked in an embrace of dangerous and forbidden love. The nun had promised her body, heart and soul to God, and what she planned to do was an unforgivable breach of her vows. And she knew if she were caught, the punishment would be severe. The coachman sensed her apprehension and gently held her hands in his own. "Are you sure?" he asked. She took one last look at the convent and nodded. With that, the coachman gave the signal, and the coachman's aide came into view, riding atop a horse-drawn carriage. But something was wrong. Suddenly, a shot rang out, breaking the stillness of the night. The aide fell from the carriage, and a group of men emerged from the shadows and seized the lovers. Somehow, the nun's plans to elope had been discovered. The coachman and his aide were beheaded, but the nun would suffer a fate far worse. She was dragged back to the convent and bricked up alive in its walls, where she slowly starved to death in her living tomb. But this was just the start of the nun's story, and just as she promised, her spirit would become a source of fear and dread to all those who encountered it. Welcome to Paranormal FM, your home of the strange, unexplained, and all things that go bump in the night. It's another stormy night, so make yourself a drink and snuggle up under a warm blanket as we prepare to explore the haunting of Borley Rectory and the true story of the nun. It was 1862, and Reverend Henry Bull had just moved into the newly built rectory in the small village of Borley, Essex, in England. The previous rectory had burned to the ground 2 decades earlier, but it wouldn't be long until the ghosts of the past would make themselves known in the present. It was a warm summer's evening, and Reverend Bull was strolling along the road back to the rectory when he heard the unmistakable sound of horses' hooves approaching from behind. He turned to see a black horse-drawn carriage being driven by 2 men, but there was something strange about the coachman that he couldn't put his finger on. It was only when they drew nearer that, to his horror, he realized the 2 coachmen were headless. He stared, frozen in fear, as the carriage passed him, then ran all the way back to the rectory. A few nights later, the nun would make herself known to the family. They were sat in the dining room one evening, enjoying dinner, when one of the Bull children suddenly looked up from her plate and asked who was at the window. The family turned, and to their shock, they saw the face of a nun peering sadly in at them. As Henry Bull stood to greet her, he felt goosebumps form on his arms, as the temperature in the dining room suddenly dropped. When he looked back, the nun had disappeared. It was clear that whatever was at the window was not a person. The nun's appearance at the dining room window became so frequent and so unsettling that Henry Bull had the window bricked up so the family could eat in peace. But this only made things worse, and the nun, seemingly frustrated at being ignored by the family, started to make her presence known inside the house. Every night at 10:30 p.m, heavy footsteps were heard throughout the house. The servant bells rang even after the wires were cut. Strange lights were seen outside and underneath closed doors, and items would be moved or go missing. While these events were unsettling and occasionally frightening, the family never felt threatened by the presence in their home. But this would soon change. What happened next seems to suggest that whatever was haunting Borley Rectory was something more sinister than the spirit of a heartbroken nun. As we've covered in the case of the Sally House haunting, it is not unusual for malignant forces to manifest as something seemingly harmless to gain access to a family. Reverend Bull was drifting into sleep when he was jolted awake by the sound of screams filling the house. He instinctively leapt out of bed, but it took him a moment to realise the screams were those of one of his daughters. He followed the screams down the dark corridors of the rectory until he reached the room they were coming from. He burst in and found his daughter sat, crying on the bed, holding her face. "She hit me," she said, removing her hand from her cheek and revealing a large red handprint where she'd been slapped. While the nighttime occurrences intensified, the nun established her terrifying presence in the home during the day. A few days later, Reverend Bull was in his study when he heard his children playing in the house. He smiled to himself as the sound of children's laughter filled the home. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and in its place he overheard nervous whispers. In the hallway the children were playing, a door to a darkened room had opened on its own, capturing their attention and piquing their curiosity. The children edged toward the door and peered in. Darkness stared back at them, beckoning them to enter. Curiosity overcame their trepidation, and they walked into the room. Despite the darkness, they were able to make out the outline of a wardrobe at the far end. But there was something else. Something moving, and then abruptly stopped, as if it knew it had been seen. The figure slowly turned its head towards the children, and although they couldn't see its face, they felt it glaring at them. Without warning, it advanced upon them. They could only stare, frozen in fear, their screams trapped in their throats. As it neared them, they could see it was dressed in the dark, tattered robe of a nun that hung loosely from a skeletal form. Hateful, sunken eyes glared at the children from her emaciated face. Her lips were upturned in a snarl that revealed jagged, discoloured teeth. She collided towards the children, reaching for them with long, bony fingers, the nails of which were either broken or missing, as if she had been desperately trying to claw herself free from somewhere in a past life. This was enough to break their trance, and the children screamed and screamed and screamed. Reverend Bull leapt out of his seat and ran towards the screams. He found his children pale and shaken with fear. When they told him what they saw, he did his best to reassure them that there was nothing to be afraid of, although he was secretly starting to wonder if this was true. In October 1928, Reverend Guy Eric Smith moved into the rectory with his wife Mabel, following the death of Reverend Harry Bull the previous year. Within days of moving in, Mabel would make a discovery that appeared to be the first piece of evidence of a nun having died at Borley Rectory. She was cleaning the house when she found a box on the library shelf. In the box was a round object wrapped in newspaper. Her curiosity piqued. She removed the newspaper and gasped in horror at what she found. Staring back at her was a human skull, later to be identified as female. The two of them agreed to give the skull a proper burial, but this would not be enough to put the ghosts of Borley Rectory to rest. Mabel had disturbed something, and that night the hauntings began. The Smiths had retired to bed for the evening, and just as they were settling down, They were disturbed by the sound of heavy footsteps walking past their bedroom. Thinking it was an intruder, Reverend Smith called out, but received no reply. He crept to the door and carefully opened it, but saw no one. The footsteps became an almost nightly occurrence, but they never saw anyone. This was identical to the phenomenon the Ball family reported, and just like the Ball family, the Smiths witnessed strange lights in the home, objects moving, bells ringing, and the spectre of a nun moving through the rectory grounds. Keys were dislodged from their locks and found several feet away from the doors. But the phenomena that convinced the Smiths to get help were the disembodied voices heard throughout the home. One day, Reverend Smith was walking through the rectory when he heard a woman groaning in the chapel. Assuming it was his wife, he hurried to help her. As he rushed into the chapel, the sounds of the pained woman continued to reverberate in the room, but the room was empty. In desperation, the Smiths placed an advert in the Daily Mirror asking for help. The Mirror sent a reporter to investigate the events at Borley Rectory. They arrived on the 12th of June, 1929. Reverend Guy Smith was waiting expectantly for their arrival, and breathed a sigh of relief as he saw a car he assumed to be that of the investigating team pulling into the rectory. A man he immediately recognised to be Harry Price enthusiastically jumped out of the car and introduced himself to Smith. Price explained that the purpose of his visit was to scientifically study the reported phenomena and, where possible, provide an explanation for what the Smith family had been experiencing. That night, Harry Price led a séance in which the Smiths and the two sisters of previous tenant Reverend Harry Ball participated. They didn't make contact with the nun, but the spirit of Harry Ball came through and made the startling revelation that he'd been murdered at the rectory. Reverend Smith jumped up, visibly shaken, and ordered the séance to stop immediately. This would herald the start of unprecedented levels of paranormal activity in the rectory. Up until now, the haunting took the form of noises, objects being moved, and the occasional manifestations of the nun, but now it was becoming more violent. Stones, vases, and other objects were thrown around, and one time, while Price was having lunch with the Smiths, a glass candlestick struck an iron stove near his head, showering him in shards of glass. There was an incident in which Harry Price was returning to the rectory with a reporter, and an entire pane of glass fell from an upstairs window and crashed to the ground, narrowly missing the two men. Price left a few days later, having documented countless incidents of ghostly and poltergeist activity. But this would be just the start of his association with Borley Rectory. The hauntings continued just as before, and just 9 months after moving in, the Smiths left the rectory for good. The Foysters' time at Borley Rectory will provide some of the most disturbing and compelling accounts of paranormal activity ever recorded, but would end with a sex scandal that shocked the nation. Reverend Lionel Foyster moved in with his wife Marianne and adopted 4-year-old daughter Adelaide on October the 16th, 1930, and the strange events started immediately. Marianne was unpacking boxes downstairs on the first day of their arrival when she thought she heard her husband calling her from upstairs. She found this strange, as she last saw him playing outside with their daughter. She glanced through the open front door, and when she saw them both there, she shrugged it off. That was until a few minutes later, when she once more heard her name being called from upstairs. and the sound of heavy footsteps from above. She looked up, and at the top of the stairs she saw her husband, now dressed in his clerical vestments, walking briskly across the landing towards their bedroom. She walked upstairs to ask him why he was dressed for service, but when she walked into their bedroom, she was the only one there. This was just the start of a series of terrifying events, of which Marianne was the primary focus. Personal items like her wristwatch would disappear, and one time, while carrying a candle upstairs to their bedroom, she was struck so hard in the face that she was left with a mark on her eye that was seen for days after. Marianne wasn't the only one affected by the haunting. There were events experienced by her husband, such as the sound of footsteps in the night, objects such as bottles and stones being thrown, and windows being broken. On one occasion their daughter was locked in her room, even though there was no lock on the door. Each unexplained event was meticulously recorded by Reverend Foyster, who, being aware of the rectory's reputation, was fascinated by the phenomena occurring in their home. But whatever was haunting Borley Rectory had taken a particularly violent dislike to Marianne. One evening, Reverend Foyster was in his study, recording the strange events of the day, when he was interrupted by the sound of a woman's moans. He stopped to listen, unsure of what he heard, but the noises stopped. He returned to his work, but moments later there was banging coming from upstairs, and the moans started again. Panic surged through his chest when he recognized the moans as those of his wife. He called out to her fearfully as he ascended the staircase to their bedroom. By the time he got there, the moaning and banging had stopped. But when he opened the door, Marianne was on the floor in her nightgown, her hair dishevelled. She told him that the spirit had tried to suffocate her with a pillow as she lay in bed, and then threw her to the floor. A short time later, writing started appearing on the walls, addressing Marianne directly. Some of it was illegible, but what could be understood told Marianne to get help, indicating that she was in some kind of danger. There was another message that cryptically read, "Get light, mass prayers," which further supported the notion that Marianne was in communication with an entity of religious conviction. The Foysters contacted Harry Price, who was all too happy to help, but his investigation was cut short after falling out with Reverend Foyster when he asserted his belief that Marianne was responsible for faking some of the poltergeist activity. Despite the Reverend's objections, Price's suspicions of Marianne would be vindicated when she confessed to having an ongoing affair with their lodger, Frank Peerless. She explained that she blamed supernatural phenomena for the bangs and moans her husband had been hearing. The scandal caused a sensation, but the story of the nun and Borley Rectory was far from over. Harry Price returned to the rectory a short time later and made a discovery which appeared to finally prove there was a nun buried in its walls. After the Foysters left, Harry Price leased the rectory and started an intensive investigation. It was during a séance conducted by medium Helen Glanville in 1938 that he received the breakthrough he was looking for. A spirit came through who identified herself as a French nun called Marie Lair. She told the medium that she had been murdered and that her remains were in the rectory's basement. This revelation, combined with the word "well" found on the walls of the rectory, convinced Harry Price to excavate the cellar. And it was here they made an incredible discovery. Deep in the cellar walls, the excavation team uncovered human remains, which, when sent away for analysis, were proven to be those of a young woman. But the nun was not the only spirit who came through during the séance. A second, unidentified spirit warned that within a year, the rectory would be destroyed by fire. And on the 27th of February, 1939, less than a year later, a paraffin lamp was mysteriously knocked over and set fire to the rectory, burning it to the ground. A policeman who attended the fire later asked Captain William Gregson, the rectory's new owner, about the lady and gentleman in cloaks he had seen leaving the house as it was burning. Gregson had been alone all evening. It was an appropriately creepy end to England's most haunted house. The nun's remains were given a proper burial, and the rectory was demolished in 1944. And this is where you'd expect the story to end. Except it doesn't. With the rectory no longer standing, whatever force once resided in its grounds found a home in the nearby church. Countless paranormal investigators over the years have visited the church, but by far the most famous are Ed and Lorraine Warren. Their experiences in Borley Church introduced the terrifying legacy of the nun to a worldwide audience of moviegoers. As soon as Ed and Lorraine walked up the narrow stone footpath and laid their eyes on the quaint Norman church, they knew this was no ordinary religious building. Churches and other buildings dedicated to God typically emanate a sense of warmth and safety, but Borley Church was very different. It radiated an ungodly darkness and malevolence that belied the hallowed purpose intended for its original construction. When Lorraine stepped into the church, she felt an immediate and powerful presence of something unlike anything else she'd ever encountered in all her years of paranormal investigations. "I feel the presence of a nun in this church," she said to Ed as they entered. Ed could feel it too, and immediately started taking photos, one of which captured the ghost of a monk or priest looking through a book. Lorraine was suddenly overcome by an intense feeling of fear. She turned and saw a black mass of undeniable evil moving towards her. She managed to move out of its way, and the two left the church a short time later.
The first experience for me was phenomenal. It was really phenomenal. It's about the only place, Tony, other than going into a home where poltergeist activity is prominent, that everything happens as soon as you get involved. As soon as you walk in, as soon as you get involved in going into this church and beginning your research, something is bound to happen.
Some time later, Lorraine was at home reading when she sensed an evil presence. She looked up and saw the black mass she recognized from her encounter in the church. She commanded it to leave, and fortunately, it did. The Haunting at Borley Rectory and the investigations by Harry Price, combined with the Warrens' experiences at Borley Church, all contributed to the creation of one of the most recognisable and terrifying characters in the history of cinematic horror. So the next time you indulge in a movie from the Conjuring universe, be sure to give a word of thanks to the little village of Borley where it all began. That's all from Paranormal FM. Thank you for sharing your evening with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, share and subscribe.